So the reading's taken from Daniel, chapter 6, and it's verses 1 to 5. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them, so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." This is the word of the Lord. Thank you.
So we have a new government. And the work of change begins immediately, he said. And the one who wrote the speech for him outside Downing Street, he nicked from the Archbishop of Canterbury. She was the Archbishop of Canterbury's speechwriter. So we stand on now wondering, what will the next 5 years be like? What about those behind the scenes? What is going to happen? Could government function something like this? Thanks, Steve.
Makes me feel rather downcast. If it's our job to carry out government policies, shouldn't we believe in them?
What an extraordinary idea.
Why?
Bernard, I have served 11 governments in the past 30 years. If I'd believed in all their policies, I would have been passionately committed to keeping out of the common market and passionately committed to going into it. I would have been utterly convinced of the rightness of nationalizing steel and of denationalizing it and renationalizing it. In capital punishment, I'd have been a fervent retentionist and an ardent abolitionist. I would have been a Keynesian and a Friedmanite, a grammar school preserver and destroyer, a nationalization freak and a privatization maniac, but above all, I would have been a stark-staring, raving schizophrenic.
I would still argue that is one of the greatest comedies of the modern era. I think it is sheer class. Now, with a new government, you will all have views of whether or not things should be nationalised. You will know in your own mind how big you think the government is. Maybe you think it should be bigger. Maybe like Ronald Reagan, you think the most scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." So what I want to do today, Steve, can we have the first slide, would you mind, is this. What does the Bible say about government? I have no intention of getting into an argument about policy, about what government policy should be. I'm not going to stand here and attack Labour, or the Tories, or Reform, or anyone else. That is for you as a Christian in your conscience to decide where you could place your X on the policies that you have read and discussed. I do want to say before I begin that actually you being here is an act of politics. Now you may say, what's that got to do with anything? The church and politics don't mix. Yes, they do. And I think sometimes we should stop pretending that the two spheres don't marry. Because you being here is political in this. You take for granted the government, satraps and administrators don't care that you're in church. They're not interested whether or not you worship. They're not interested in what I say. They're not interested if I call Keir Starmer every name under the sun. They're not coming for me. So what I want to ask is, what does the Bible, the book we stand on, because recently we've done things about ourselves. Jess did anxiety, Sarah did stress, and that's very much our own personal walk with God. So after this election, what about us as a body? What does God say to us now? We have a Labour government with a majority that basically means they can almost do anything they want. What does he ask of us as the administration of government, the institution that is government itself? Can we have the next slide, Steve? Sorry, this one. This is where I got to. What is we the people and what is the Bible? What What does it say? Well, in my reading of it, it has, like Jess said about anxiety, it has a lot to say about government. But in many ways, I would argue it's ambivalent about it. So number one, government in the Bible is legitimate. Can you put the next slide up, Steve, please? Thank you. Everyone must submit to governing authorities. For all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. Peter says something similar. It's in the Psalms. Government is a legitimate thing. It exists. It didn't exist in Genesis. Now let's do some theology for a moment. God created and saw that it was good. He would have been the king. He would have had the government. But the fall happened. And then very quickly thereafter you hear the first murder, Cain and Abel, and things go wrong and you get Babel. So obviously by that moment, it says in the Bible, everyone did what was right in his own eyes in Judges. So the argument there is that unless there's some form of authority, you and I would do whatever we wanted. So you need a government. And Paul here is telling everyone what the purpose of government is. And first and foremost, it's to keep order. Paul was a Roman citizen, and he could traverse the Roman world freely. And remember when he was arrested and whipped, and he tells the jailer and the governor that this had happened to him, a Roman citizen? The governor wets himself, because he realizes he has broken one of the greatest commandments of the Roman Empire. So Paul and Peter and the rest say, pray for your government. It is there to keep order, to punish wrongdoing. I want to ask carefully. I've not known, but the nurse that's been accused of killing all those babies, she has been convicted. Who here would say that they were not glad, if she did it, that she's no longer able to be near babies? You happy with that? Would you be happy with that result? I'm assuming you will. And I'm assuming if you heard of someone who was stabbed, you'd want the person with the knife arrested, yes? Right. So that's the idea of government, that it is a legitimate thing to have. But let me go back. You're here because you're free. You could choose to walk out. So a government is legitimate. But let me come back to what I said at the beginning. That means then there's an obligation on every single one of us as Christians for this, to pray for our government, to know what they are and what they're up to. And I'm not having to go and vote, like I said at the beginning, according to where your conscience leads you. You may believe indeed that the government should be more involved in life, that it should take more of national wealth and distribute it. Vote that way. You may think, actually, no, but that's your conscience. But government is legitimate. I don't think we can say, as much as I love the Reformation, with the radical reformers, back to theology, back to Daniel, that it is so fallen, so corrupt like those there, that they wanted rid of Daniel because he was honest and had integrity, and they didn't like it. And let's be brutal. Let's be brutal. I did a funeral where a man and a woman who were holding hands were told not to during lockdown. And then what did we find? They were partying as if it didn't matter. Did that anger anyone here? Yes, doesn't it just? So let's do politics then. Because what the radical reformers said is this is so corrupt, it's run by corrupt people like Daniel's lot, that just want to make themselves prime minister for the sake of it, for the joy of it, for the power of it, have nothing to do with it. It's corrupt and evil. I don't think the Bible supports that view. This is what I'm saying. This is where you have to be Bereans again. Acts 17. Search the scriptures for yourself. See if what I'm telling you is true. Government is a legitimate thing to keep order, to punish crime, and also to reward good. The question is then, in the Bible, is how far? So number one, it's legitimate. Number two, I want to suggest it's limited. Government is limited. It's only so far it can stray. Remember when you got Samuel who comes to Saul, and Saul he's given strange fire, it's called. He stepped onto a terrain that was not his. Am I saying that there should be a clean break between religion and government? No. I'm not. They combine. We as the church have a voice. And we have bishops in the House of Lords. Obviously in the United States they don't. Because they came to a very different understanding of faith. Because their moment was that government very much interfered and had no limit within the church. It imposed a prayer book. And for a moment's tongue-in-cheek, it chose bishops. And it chose them Kind of like this. Does the second one play, Steve? It didn't at 9.
Bernard. Prime Minister.
Ah, Humphrey. Sherry?
Yes, thank you.
Humphrey, what's a modernist in the Church of England?
Ah, well, the word modernist is code for non-believer.
You mean an atheist?
No, Prime Minister. An atheist clergyman couldn't continue to draw his stipend. So, when they stop believing in God, they call themselves modernists.
How could the Church of England suggest an atheist as Bishop of Bury St Edmunds?
Well, very easily. The Church of England is primarily a social organisation, not a religious one.
Is it?
Oh, yes. It's part of the rich social fabric of this country. So bishops need to be the sort of chaps who speak properly, know which knife and fork to use. The sort of people one can look up to.
So that's what Peter meant when he said that Canon Stanford's wife was eminently suitable.
Of course. Cheers.
Is there really no other possible candidate?
Well, not really. There are a couple of better jobs available recently, you see.
What's better than a bishop? A rook?
Very droll. No, well, the Dean of Windsor is a better job, or Westminster. Such preferment enables one to be on intimate terms with the royals.
So being a bishop is just a matter of status. A question of dressing up in cassocks and gaiters.
Yes, though gaiters are now only worn at significant religious events, like the Royal Garden Party. Well, the church is trying to be more relevant.
To God?
No, of course not, Prime Minister. I mean relevant in sociological terms.
So the ideal candidate from the Church of England's point of view would be a cross between a socialite and a socialist.
Precisely.
I know that's tongue-in-cheek and a bit naughty, but it's the kind of cynical idea of bishops and how they're appointed by prime ministers when the government interferes in how the bishops of the Church of England are appointed. And I've read some stuff, and that's how it cynically was. They had to come from the right status of society. That's why most of them have been to Oxford or Cambridge. They knew how upper-class people ate. They could move smoothly around certain sections of society because the government chose the bishops. And there was an archbishop called Laud in the Reformation era that imposed upon the Church of England certain services, certain structures. He said people like me should not preach, really, we should just do the sacraments, which eventually forced many, many people onto the ship that went out from Plymouth out to the New World and to America. Hence why the Constitution says they will make no bonds with the government established, because they saw what happened. So I'm suggesting that government in the Bible should be limited. It should know how far it should go and where it should stop. But it is legitimate. So it's for us to know this, to ask how far is the government encroaching, and at what point do we say this far and no further? Go back to where I started at the beginning. We are free. We are to pray for a government. We are to submit. So it says we pay our taxes. That's what Paul said. We are seen to pray, to walk, to do good, so that the government looks at us and says, whoa, what's going on here? What difference are they making? And we saw some of that during the lockdown, where the news actually talked about how much churches were doing, how we were delivering goods, going to the people, knocking on doors, stepping back, seeing, doing good works that the government couldn't do. I would also say the Bible teaches constantly that Paul talks about do this in Corinthians in your conscience. If you eat meat, do it unto God. If you don't, do it unto God. So I would argue the scripture says this so far the government can go. It cannot interfere, for me, with teaching. Keir Starmer said this more in his speech, I will govern without doctrine. Fine. The church cannot. Or we're not the church. But I would say, in terms of limitation, the government cannot tell the church what to preach. It cannot inform the church what it must and must not say. We know this happens in China. The official Catholic Church in China, the bishops, sorry, I know that was a bit naughty, but the bishops are appointed by the Chinese government. And they preach the glory of communism and the greatness of Xi. We see what happens in North Korea, which I'll come to in a minute. But in this country, it is not so. The government still has the same bishops, but so do we. Because we should. So it should be limited in what it reaches out to do. And we should be able to say, no, hang on. Because remember what happened in Scotland? I don't know what you thought of this, but the Scottish Government proposed a person for every family to see that their children were happy. Also in this nation, there was an assertion that the conversion therapy ban would mean that you couldn't discuss certain things with your family in your own home. Or that if someone came to me and said, will you pray with me for this, I could get arrested for doing so. It is so in Australia, in Victoria. You cannot pray certain prayers without being arrested in the state of Victoria. Labour has said that's not true. They're not going to do that. But my question stands. What if they did? What then? Because the next bit of the Bible about its ambivalence of government is that it's legitimate. Let me say that again. It has a function, and we should be thankful it has that function. But it's limited, and it should be careful how far it goes, because ultimately the foundation of us is God. The government will be on his shoulders. We remind them that the Ancient of Days, they will bow one day. So it cannot tread on certain things, I want to argue. Finally, government is dangerous. That's why it's ambivalent about it. That's why the radical reformers didn't trust it. That's why the Plymouth Brethren left. Because they saw it much like Daniel's thing, that it was corrupt. And we ourselves have seen the expenses scandal. We've seen politicians bet on the election, insider trading almost. And it brings us that almost, come on, be honest, this election has, hasn't it? They've all said it, that integrity in politics has gone. That we don't trust them anymore. That what comes out of their mouth, we think they say one thing like Humphrey and Bernard and they do something else entirely when they get into power. In fact, Keir Starmer was asked that. Someone said, you sit here now saying this, how do I know in 12 months' time you won't say, oh, but I didn't know what I know now, therefore I'm going to break all the promises I've made. And he answered it honestly, but there was a titter of laughter. Not just at him, but at Rishi Sunak too. Because there's this idea that we don't trust them. Like the satraps, how do we get Daniel? He's got integrity. We don't like it. We want to make money from it. Look at what's going on in the greatest nation on earth. Sorry, forgive me, the most powerful nation on earth. I want to say, and shout at me, is that the best that that nation could offer as president? Is that the best that they can do? But yet, that nation, in the next 4 to 8 years, is going to face some very, very dangerous things. China want Taiwan. Make no bones about that. They want it. And have made it very plain, if war is necessary to get it, to war they will go. Then the question is, what does America do? The next question for us as Christians is, what does Israel do? Is Lebanon next? What about Ukraine? How long's that going to go on? Is Putin going to expand? Look at France. France is in an absolute tumult at the moment. And do we as Christians say, it's nothing to do with us, we don't want to preach politics? No, I think it's legitimate to do so. To be involved, to be aware. Jesus said, while it's light, be about his work. So it's legitimate for you and I to be involved in politics. If we so choose to be called to serve, serve. Go and do it because it's legitimate. In these next 5 years, write to your MP. Ask the questions because it's legitimate to do so. How are they spending your money? On what are they teaching our children? Because Naomi was walking with me and she said, so for the next 5 years they make decisions and that's it. I said, I'm sorry, you're not able to vote yet. So yes, on behalf of the children, we need to say to government, you're legitimate, but I'm going to ask you questions. Why? Because we can. But let's look at dangerous again for a moment. Paul wrote the Roman world. Preach, pray for it, do this, but also remember, outside on our board it says Jesus is Lord. No one cares, the government's not interested. Right, what I'm going to ask you to do now is remember the Christmas story. Take out the name Jesus from that story for a moment and put in the name Augustus. Augustus Caesar. And you'll have an idea as to why saying Jesus is Lord back then was an act of political revolution and rebellion. Because Augustus was God. Augustus was good news. When he gave a proclamation, it was led by the satraps. Here is good news. Augustus Caesar is God. He has brought you light and good news. Statues were everywhere of this man. They still got some. So Paul knew full well that the government that kept peace, that allowed him to preach the gospel and walk the Roman world could turn on him at any moment. And it did. And that's something else we avoid often in the church today. The idea that there is a price to being a Christian for some. Remember what happens to Paul in the end? He appeals to Rome, and to Rome he goes, and what does Rome do? Cuts his head off. What happens to Peter, anyone? What happened to Peter? He was crucified what? Upside down. What happens to John? He was exiled to Patmos. What happens to Stephen? Stoned to death. Can anyone please tell me what happened in the reign of Nero? Anyone? Yeah. To the point that Christians were persecuted because Rome burned, even to the point where Roman citizens said, this is too much. This is Nero looking for an escape and a blame game. So government can be dangerous too. And I go back to my earlier point. Again, I'm just saying this Keir Starmer's got a majority of over 200. I'm not saying he will do this, but if he wanted to, he could pass a legislation that says you cannot preach Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life because it's divisive. You must preach all religions are good. All religions lead to the same road. What then? Do I go along with it because it's the government? Or like Peter, stand before the Sanhedrin, does he say, make your mind up, is it right to follow you or to follow God? Because Romans 13, he's often thrown out that you must obey the government. I read something chilling, really chilling, 1933. A bishop stood in a cathedral and used that very verse for a great sermon. It was a good sermon. Sorry, it was. But I said 1933 in Germany. Can anyone guess what he was preaching about? Have a guess. Submission to Hitler, yes. That you should submit to Hitler. And let me say again, what happened in that Lutheran text. Martin Luther, the great reformer, if you read his writings about the Jews, it is vile. And yet Lutherans and Hitler used such sermons, such talk, to justify the Holocaust. Because the Jews wouldn't convert. Luther called them pigs and dogs and all kinds of names. Burn their synagogues, he said. So government can be dangerous. And so can it be for you as a Christian if you decide it's legitimate, but it's overstretching its bounds, and this far and no further. It may cost you. Go back to China, North Korea. Where's Barnabas again? We raised, sorry, I've lost the piece of paper, over £400 because Barnabas know full well that government is dangerous in certain places for Christians. It's a dangerous thing. It can turn its armour and its ferocity on the church at any moment. But I've come full circle in a way that we're still free. We still have that voice. Nobody is outlawing the church. No one is saying because of this, I can be arrested. No one is saying, again, let me repeat, that I could call Keir Starmer every name you want and it's recorded, but no one's going to arrest me. We still have free speech to a level. We can still buy a newspaper. You've got the Guardian on the left, you've got the Telegraph on the right. You can buy them both. You can still write to your MP and get an answer. I did. So's people in this church wrote to Paul Maynard and he responded while he was our MP. So let me repeat again, please. Government is legitimate. And I think there is a place for us to be involved, to know what government is up to, and to get involved in it. Sorry to keep repeating it, rather than just saying, well, that's that, and we'll just concentrate on preaching the gospel. Because that affects this. If you're a parent, a grandparent, this government's education policies are going to affect your children. There's a new consultation out about sex education. What do you want your children to know? Bluntly, what do you want them to know? And when do you want them to know it? At what age? And what do you want them to teach them? I'm asking you the question. Be Bereans. I said I didn't want to get into policy. I'm asking you as Christians. What do you want this government to do? And what are you prepared to do about it? Sit there and moan and pretend it's over there and it doesn't matter? Or say like the Bible, it's legitimate, so I need to know because I'm free and it's a privilege. And it also knows it needs its limitation. Whatever you think of the Christian Institute or the Faith in Parliament, there are Christians out there doing this. I have a book on my shelf called Those Who Show Up. That's his whole argument. Show up. Whether it's blue, red or yellow. Show up. Be interested because it's a legitimate thing to do. And when you're involved, sorry to keep repeating this, make sure it's limited. Remind it of where it should stop. Because to me, and now you are getting me, aren't you? The government should stay the heck out of my family life. We will discuss and debate things as a family. The government has no right to tell me what I can and cannot say in my home. None. Disagree with me. This is what I'm saying. And let me come to this bit too. Because this is what's happening in America right now, and I do not want it in the church. Do you know churches in America are splitting down the line? That if you say I'm voting Trump, they will boot you out. If you say I'm voting Biden, they will also get rid of you. Because Biden, they think, wants partial birth abortion, so you can't be a Christian if you're going to vote for him. Never, ever, ever, I want to say, should you leave a church over political differences. Because we've just read, the kingdom will be on his shoulders. What unites us is the body of Christ, and one day, Ancient of Days, the government's on his shoulders. We may disagree on tax, we may disagree on the size of the government, we may disagree on education policy, so be it. But what unites us ultimately is that we have a legitimate, limited government. That we as Christians remind on whom it sits. And if it starts doing what Saul does with strange fire, like Samuel, we have the guts to remind it. That is not your role. All this is reserved for our God. And here, to quote Martin Luther, here I stand, I can do no other. But I want to say this. Are we prepared to pay the price? I know it's kind of repetitive, this, isn't it? But are we prepared ultimately, in the end, to pay the price the early Christians paid? Are we prepared to pay the price Paul paid? Am I prepared to pay the price? Come back with me a moment to the Reformation. I'm nearly finished. Where this communion here, it was declared that the body and blood of Christ was literally present. That the bread and the wine changed into the body and the blood of Christ. And to say anything other than that was an anathema that would get you burnt at the stake. I don't believe anything of that. I don't think there's any presence in the Eucharist at all. It's like those men on D-Day. They remembered their friends. In a way, they're present in memory. Like we remember those we've lost. But the communion we call to mind, that would have got me burnt. My question is, would I have been burnt for it? Like Thomas Cranmer, would I have put my hand out in the fire and said, this is what I stand for? I don't know. And I don't want to depress anyone this morning because, look, let me start where we began. We are free. We are free. And our government is not coming for us. But for many others in this world, it is. Look at our Iranian friends. They have fled. I told you last week, I read of an Iranian woman. Iran said, if you are born a Christian, they don't bother you. But if you proselytize, if you seek to convert, they will arrest you. They will come for you. But if you convert from Islam to Christianity, as this woman did, they accused her of a Zionist conspiracy and imprisoned her for 2 years. So I'm sorry, pretending it doesn't exist, and I don't want to be harsh here, doesn't make it go away. We have to be aware of the world in which we live and how our vote and our voice is used and how those fleeing persecution get to this country and how we treat them when they get here. There's your voice. You may agree that perhaps it's too high numbers and it needs controlling, so be it. But how? How is it controlled? In a humane way. Maybe you want to go back into the European Union. Maybe you think that's what we shouldn't do. These are all debates that can happen within the church. But it should not divide us, because ultimately the government will be on his shoulders. You are free, and I finish here. And I leave a challenge that you get involved. It's legitimate, but this government's got some majority. Watch it. Hold it to its promises. Remind it when it breaks the promises it's given you. The same for the opposition. I'm not making party political points here. Get involved. Be aware of how far government should go and be prepared to remind it as a Christian, this is as far as it goes. And then be aware that it can be dangerous. The Bible is very ambivalent about government, but it knows it's needed. I finished there. So this is more for us as a church, as a body. When we pray, when we cry out, what does this government want to do? What do we say? How do we do it? And how far do we go? I say this sincerely, and this is where I will stop. When they shut the churches down, fair enough. Fair enough. But I say this, never again will I lock the church entirely without prayer. If we ever have another pandemic like that, I will open this church for people to pray. Because I've talked to working people. I've heard them say that they wanted just to come into church for a minute because they were frightened. They've been working all day with people all over them, masked a lot. And what did they find, ladies and gentlemen? The church was locked. I'm not talking Sundays like this, that was obvious. We shouldn't be together, it's too dangerous. But even if I sit there and they sit there, I want them to know that we're praying for them. That we're here as a church in their life, because they were on the front line. They weren't sat at home, working from home, getting 80% of their wages, and I'm not knocking that. They were on the coalface, they were in the supermarkets. And I've read enough that said they felt abandoned by the church. So there's a stand I've taken. Disagree with me. But that's the stand I will take. So the government, could you put the slide up again, Steve, the last one, please? So when we come to this then, we're going to pray for our government now. In a moment, when we pray, we're going to pray for our government. And we're going to cry out in this new day for mercy for the nation. I'm going to pray for the government, and then we'll ask you, as Christians, to pray for mercy, to pray for Keir Starmer, to pray for the cabinet, to pray for this nation and the government policies, to think again as you leave, as Bereans, how do I get involved in something legitimate? How do I ensure it's limited? And when am I aware of its dangers? But we submit to governing authorities for the sake of Christ. But first we're going to sing. And this great song, that's why I chose it. Great is the Lord, the city of our God. It's the holy place. We bow down on our knees. And yes, you may, I haven't got time, go to Augustine and the two cities. I'm not sure I agree with all of that, but that's up to you to find if you wish to read it. Because a lot of our theology is based on Augustine. Our theological, political theology. And also on Calvin and Geneva and all of that. And if I could ever go on sabbatical, I'm not, I would do a master's in government theory and Christian responses to governments and the political ideas of government. It fascinates me. We as Christians, what do we do? So let's stand and let's sing. Let's sing together. We've already sung Crown Him with Many Crowns. Let's sing Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise.